Positioning the battle for your mind. Introduction. What we have here is a failure to communicate. How often have you heard that bromide? Failure to communicate is the single, most common, most universal reason people give for their problems. Business problems, government problems, labor problems, marriage problems. If only people took the time to communicate their feelings, to explain their reasons, the assumption is that many of the problems of the world would somehow disappear. People seem to believe any problem can be solved if only the parties sit down and talk. Unlikely. Today, communication itself is the problem. We have become the world's first overcommunicated society. Each year, we send more and receive less. A new approach to communication. This book has been written about a new approach to communication called positioning. And most of the examples are from the most difficult of all forms of communication, advertising. A form of communication that, from the point of view of the recipient, is held in low esteem. Advertising is, for the most part, unwanted and unliked. In some cases, advertising is thoroughly detested. To many intellectuals, advertising is selling your soul to corporate America, a subject not worthy of serious study. In spite of its reputation, or perhaps because of it, the field of advertising is a superb testing ground for theories of communication. If it works in advertising, most likely it will work in politics, religion, or any other activity that requires mass communication. So the examples in this book could just as well have been taken from the field of politics, war, business, or even the science of chasing the opposite sex. Or any form of human activity which involves influencing the minds of other people. Whether you want to promote a car, a cola, a computer, a candidate, or your own career. Positioning is a concept that has changed the nature of advertising, a concept so simple, people have difficulty understanding how powerful it is. Every successful politician practices positioning. So do Procter & Gamble and Johnson & Johnson. Positioning defined. Positioning starts with a product. A piece of merchandise, a service, a company, an institution, or even a person. Perhaps yourself. But positioning is not what you do to a product. Positioning is what you do to the mind of the prospect. That is, you position the product in the mind of the prospect. So it's incorrect to call the concept product positioning. You're not really doing something to the product itself. Not that positioning doesn't involve change. It often does. But changes made in the name, the price, and the package are really not changes in the product at all. They're basically cosmetic changes done for the purpose of securing a worthwhile position in the prospect's mind. Positioning is the first body of thought that comes to grips with the difficult problem of getting heard in our overcommunicated society. How positioning got started. If one word can be said to have marked the course of advertising in the past decade, the word is positioning. Positioning has become a buzzword among advertising, sales, and marketing people. Not only in America, but around the world. Teachers, politicians, and editorial writers are using the word. Most people think positioning got started in 1972 when we wrote a series of articles entitled The Positioning Era for the Trade Paper Advertising Age. Since then, we have given more than 1,000 speeches on positioning to advertising groups in 21 different countries around the world. And we have given away more than 150,000 copies of our little orange booklet, which reprints the Advertising Age articles. Positioning has changed the way the advertising game is being played today. We're the third largest selling coffee in America, say the Sanka radio commercials. The third largest? Whatever happened to those good old advertising words like first and best and finest? Well, the good old advertising days are gone forever, and so are the words. Today you find comparatives, not superlatives. Avis is only number 2 in rent-a-cars, so why go with us? We try harder. 7-Up, the Uncola. Along Madison Avenue, these are called positioning slogans. And the advertising people who write them spend their time and research money looking for positions, or holes, in the marketplace. But positioning has stirred up interest well beyond Madison Avenue. With good reason. Anyone can use positioning strategy to get ahead in the game of life. And look at it this way, if you don't understand and use the principles, your competitors undoubtedly will. 1. What positioning is all about. How did a hard sell concept like positioning become so popular in a business noted for its creativity? In truth, the past decade might well be characterized as a return to reality. White nights and black eye patches gave way to such positioning concepts as light beer from Miller. Everything you always wanted in a beer. And less. Poetic? Yes. Artful? Yes. But also a straightforward, clearly defined explanation of the basic positioning premise. To be successful today, you must touch base with reality. And the only reality that counts is what's already in the prospect's mind. To be creative, to create something that doesn't already exist in the mind, is becoming more and more difficult, if not impossible. The basic approach of positioning is not to create something new and different, but to manipulate what's already up there in the mind, to retie the connections that already exist. Today's marketplace is no longer responsive to the strategies that worked in the past. There are just too many products, too many companies, and too much marketing noise. The question most frequently asked by positioning skeptics is, why? Why do we need a new approach to advertising and marketing? The overcommunicated society. The answer is that we have become an overcommunicated society. The per capita consumption of advertising in America today is $376.62 a year. That compares with $16.87 in the rest of the world. If you spend $1 million a year on advertising, you are bombarding the average consumer with less than a half cent of advertising, spread out over 365 days. A consumer already exposed to $376.61 1/2 worth of other advertising. In our overcommunicated society, to talk about the impact of your advertising is to seriously overstate the potential effectiveness of your message. Advertising is not a sledgehammer. It's more like a light fog, a very light fog that envelopes your prospects. In the communication jungle out there, the only hope to score big is to be selective, to concentrate on narrow targets, to practice segmentation. In a word, positioning. The mind, as a defense against the volume of today's communications, screens, and rejects much of the information offered it. In general, the mind accepts only that which matches prior knowledge or experience. Millions of dollars have been wasted trying to change minds with advertising. Once a mind is made up, it's almost impossible to change it. Certainly not with a weak force like advertising. Don't confuse me with the facts, my mind's made up. That's a way of life for most people. The average person will sit still when being told something which he or she knows nothing about. Which is why news is an effective advertising approach. But the average person cannot tolerate being told he or she is wrong. Mind changing is the road to advertising disaster. The oversimplified mind. The only defense a person has in our overcommunicated society is an oversimplified mind. Not unless they repeal the law of nature that gives us only 24 hours in a day will they find a way to stuff more into the mind. The average mind is already a dripping sponge that can only soak up more information at the expense of what's already there. Yet we continue to pour more information into that supersaturated sponge and are disappointed when our messages fail to get through. Advertising, of course, is only the tip of the communication iceberg. We communicate with each other in a wide variety of bewildering ways. And in a geometrically increasing volume. The medium may not be the message, but it does seriously affect the message. Instead of a transmission system, the medium acts like a filter. Only a tiny fraction of the original material ends up in the mind of the receiver. Furthermore, what we receive is influenced by the nature of our overcommunicated society. Glittering generalities have become a way of life in our overcommunicated society. We oversimplify because that's the only way to cope. Technically, we are capable of increasing the volume of communication at least tenfold. We're experimenting with direct television broadcasting from satellites. Every home would have 100 channels or so to choose from. North American Philips has just introduced a 3½ compact disc that holds 600 megabytes of data, more than enough to store the entire Encyclopedia Britannica. Terrific. But who is working on a compact disc for the mind? Who is trying to help the prospect cope with complexity that so overwhelms the mind that the average reaction to the wealth of information today is to tighten the intake valve? To accept less and less of what is so freely available? Communication itself is the communication problem. The oversimplified message. The best approach to take in our overcommunicated society is the oversimplified message. In communication, as in architecture, less is more. You have to sharpen your message to cut into the mind. You have to jettison the ambiguities, simplify the message, and then simplify it some more if you want to make a long-lasting impression. People who depend on communication for their livelihood know the necessity of oversimplification. Let's say you are meeting with a politician whom you are trying to get elected. In the first 5 minutes, you'll learn more about your political product than the average voter is going to learn about that person in the next 5 years. Since so little material about your candidate is ever going to get into the mind of the voter, your job is really not a communication project in the ordinary meaning of the word. It's a selection project. You have to select the material that has the best chance of getting through. The enemy that is keeping your messages from hitting pay dirt is the volume of communication. Only when you appreciate the nature of the problem can you understand the solution. When you want to communicate the advantages of a political candidate or a product or even yourself, you must turn things inside out. You look for the solution to your problem not inside the product, not even inside your own mind. You look for the solution to your problem inside the prospect's mind. In other words, since so little of your message is going to get through anyway, you ignore the sending side and concentrate on the receiving end. You concentrate on the perceptions of the prospect, not the reality of the product. In politics, said John Lindsay, the perception is the reality. So, too, in advertising, in business, and in life. But what about truth? What about the facts of the situation? What is truth? What is objective reality? Every human being seems to believe intuitively that he or she alone holds the key to universal truth. When we talk about truth, what truth are we talking about? The view from the inside or the view from the outside? It does make a difference. In the words of another era, the customer is always right. And by extension, the seller or communicator is always wrong. It may be cynical to accept the premise that the sender is wrong and the receiver is right. But you really have no other choice. Not if you want to get your message accepted by another human mind. Besides, who's to say that the view from the inside looking out is any more accurate than the view from the outside looking in? By turning the process around, by focusing on the prospect rather than the product, you simplify the selection process. You also learn principles and concepts that can greatly increase your communication effectiveness. 2. The assault on the mind. As a nation, we have fallen in love with the concept of communication. In some grade schools, show and tell is now being called communication. We don't always appreciate the damage being done by our overcommunicated society. In communication, more is less. Our extravagant use of communication to solve a host of business and social problems has so jammed our channels that only a tiny fraction of all messages actually gets through. And not necessarily the most important ones either. The transmission traffic jam. Take advertising, for example. With only 6% of the world's population, America consumes 57% of the world's advertising. And you thought our use of energy was extravagant. Actually, we consume only 33% of the world's energy. Advertising, of course, is only a small channel in the communication river. Take books. Each year some 30,000 books are published in America. Every year another 30,000. Which doesn't sound like a lot until you realize it would take 17 years of reading 24 hours a day just to finish 1 year's output. Who can keep up? Take newspapers. Each year American newspapers use more than 10 million tons of newsprint. Which means that the average person consumes 94 pounds of newsprint a year. There's some question whether the average person can digest all this information. The Sunday edition of a large metropolitan newspaper like the New York Times weighs about 4½ pounds and contains some 500,000 words. To read it all, at an average reading speed of 300 words per minute, would take almost 28 hours. Not only would your Sunday be shot, but also a good part of the rest of the week too. How much is getting through? Take television. A medium barely 35 years old. A powerful and pervasive medium. Television didn't replace radio or newspapers or magazines. Each of the three older media is bigger and stronger than it ever was. Television is an additive medium. And the amount of communication added by television is awesome. 98% of all American homes have at least one television set. A third have 2 or more. 96% of all television households can receive 4 or more TV stations. A third can receive 10 or more. The average American family watches television more than 7 hours a day. More than 51 hours a week. Like motion pictures, the TV picture is really a still picture which changes 30 times a second. which means the average American family is exposed to some 750,000 television pictures a day. Not only are we being pictured to death, we are being papered to death. Take that Xerox machine down the hall. American business processes 1.4 trillion pieces of paper a year. That's 5.6 billion every working day. Down the halls at the Pentagon, copy machines crank out 350,000 pages a day for distribution throughout the Defense Department. Equal to 1,000 good-sized novels. World War II will end, said Field Marshal Montgomery, when the warring nations run out of paper. Take packaging. An 8-ounce package of Total Breakfast cereal contains 1,268 words of copy on the box, plus an offer for a free booklet on nutrition, which contains another 3,200 words. The assault on the mind takes place in many different ways. The U.S. Congress passes some 500 laws a year. That's bad enough, but regulatory agencies promulgate some 10,000 new rules and regulations in the same amount of time. And the regulatory agencies are not stingy with their words either. Consider this: the Lord's Prayer contains 56 words, the Gettysburg Address, 266, the Ten Commandments, 297, the Declaration of Independence, 300. And a recent U.S. government order setting the price of cabbage, 26,911. At the state level, over 250,000 bills are introduced each year. And 25,000 pass the legislatures to disappear into the labyrinths of the law. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Ignorance of the lawmakers apparently is. Our legislators continue to pass thousands of laws that you can't possibly keep track of. And even if you could, you couldn't possibly remember how a law might differ from one of our 50 states to another. Who reads, sees, or listens to all this outpouring of communication? There's a traffic jam on the turnpikes of the mind. Engines are overheating. Tempers are rising. George Bush, Ted Kennedy, and Chevrolet. How much do you know about George Bush? Most people know just 3 things. 1. He's good looking. 2. He's from Texas. 3. He's Vice President of the United States. Not much for a person who's been in public service for a good part of his adult life. Yet that might be just enough to make Mr. Bush President of the United States in 1988. Actually, there are many people who don't know Mr. Bush as well as you might think. A People magazine poll showed that 44% of supermarket shoppers didn't know who George Bush was, even though he had been vice president for 4 years. On the other hand, 93% of the consumers recognized Mr. Clean, the genie on the bottle of the Procter & Gamble cleaner of the same name. They recognized Mr. Clean, even though he hadn't been seen on television in 10 years, which shows the power of advertising to register a simple message. What do you know about Ted Kennedy? Probably a lot more than you know about George Bush. And probably enough to keep him from being the next president of the United States. At best, communication in an overcommunicated society is difficult. Yet you are often better off if communication doesn't take place. At least until you are ready to position yourself for the long term. You never get a second chance to make a first impression. What do the following names mean to you? Camaro, Cavalier, Celebrity, Chevette, Citation, Corvette, and Monte Carlo? Automobile model names, right? Would you be surprised to learn that these are all Chevrolet models? Chevrolet is one of the most heavily advertised products in the world. In a recent year, General Motors spent more than $178 million to promote Chevrolet in the United States. That's $487,000 a day, $20,000 an hour. What do you know about Chevrolet? About Chevrolet engines, transmissions, tires? About the seats, upholstery, steering? Be honest. How many Chevrolet models are you familiar with? And do you know the differences between them? Confusing, isn't it? The only answer to the problems of an overcommunicated society is the positioning answer. To cut through the traffic jam in the prospect's mind, you must use Madison Avenue techniques. Nearly half the jobs in the United States can be classified as information occupations. More and more people are trying to cope with the problems of our overcommunicated society. Whether you have an information job or not, you can benefit from learning the lessons of Madison Avenue. At home and in the office. The media explosion. Another reason our messages keep getting lost is the number of media we have invented to serve our communication needs. There is television, commercial, cable, and pay. There's radio, AM and FM. There's outdoor posters and billboards. There are newspapers, morning, evening, daily, weekly, and Sunday. There are magazines, mass magazines, class magazines, enthusiast magazines, business magazines, trade magazines. And, of course, buses, trucks, streetcars, subways, and taxicabs. Generally speaking, anything that moves today is carrying a message from our sponsor. Even the human body has become a walking billboard for Adidas, Gucci, Benetton, and Gloria Vanderbilt. Take advertising again. Just after World War II, the per capita consumption of advertising in the United States was about $25 a year. Today it's 15 times as much. Inflation accounts for part of this increase, but volume is also up substantially. Do you know 15 times as much about the products you buy? You may be exposed to much more advertising, but your mind can't absorb any more than it used to. There's a finite limit to how much you can take in, and advertising, even at $25 a year, was already way over the limit. That 1-quart container that sits on top of your neck can hold just so much. At $376 per person, the average American consumer is already exposed to twice as much advertising per year as the average Canadian, 4 times as much as the average English person, and 5 times as much as the average French person. While no one doubts the advertiser's financial ability to dish it out, there's some question about the consumer's mental ability to take it all in. Each day, thousands of advertising messages compete for a share of the prospect's mind. And make no mistake about it, the mind is the battleground. Between 6 inches of gray matter is where the advertising war takes place. And the battle is rough, with no holds barred and no quarter given. Advertising is a brutal business where mistakes can be costly. But out of the advertising wars, principles have been developed to help you cope with our overcommunicated society. The product explosion. Another reason our messages keep getting lost is the number of products we have invented to take care of our physical and mental needs. Take food for example. The average supermarket in the United States has some 12,000 individual products or brands on display. For the consumer, there's no relief in sight. In fact, the product explosion could get worse. In Europe they are building supermarkets, called hypermarkets, with room for several times as many products. Biggs in Cincinnati, the first hypermarket in America, stocks 60,000 products. The packaged goods industry obviously expects the proliferation to continue. Those scratch marks on the side of most grocery boxes, the universal product code, represent 10 digits. Your social security number has only 9. And the system is designed to handle more than 200 million people. And this same situation holds in the industrial field. The Thomas Register, for example, lists 80,000 companies. There are 292 manufacturers of centrifugal pumps, 326 builders of electronic controls, to take 2 categories at random. There are 500,000 active trademarks registered at the U.S. Patent Office. And 25,000 new ones get added every year. Hundreds of thousands of products are sold without trademarks too. In a typical year, the 1,500 companies listed on the New York Stock Exchange introduce more than 5,000 significant new products. And presumably a lot more than that were insignificant. Not to mention the millions of products and services marketed by America's 5 million other corporations. Take drugs. There are some 100,000 prescription drugs on the U.S. market. While many of these are specialized and used almost exclusively by medical specialists, the general practitioner still has a Herculean job to keep informed about the multitude of drug products available. Herculean? No, it's an impossible job. Even Hercules himself could not have kept up with more than a small fraction of these drugs. To expect more is to be totally ignorant of the finite capacity of even the most brilliant mind. And how does the average person cope with the product and media explosions? Not very well. Studies on the sensitivity of the human brain have established the existence of a phenomenon called sensory overload. Scientists have discovered that a person is capable of receiving only a limited amount of sensation. Beyond a certain point, the brain goes blank and refuses to function normally. Dentists have been toying with some of these discoveries. Earphones are placed on the patient, and the sound level is turned up until the sensation of pain no longer is felt. The advertising explosion. Ironically, As the effectiveness of advertising goes down, the use of it goes up. Not just in volume, but in the number of users. Doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants are dipping their toes into the advertising pool. Even institutions like churches, hospitals, and government have begun to advertise. In a recent year, the U.S. government spent $228,857,200 on advertising. Professional people used to consider advertising beneath their dignity. But as competition heats up, lawyers, dentists, optometrists, accountants, and architects are starting to promote themselves. Cleveland-based Hyatt Legal Services is spending $4.5 million a year on television advertising. Jacoby & Myers is another big legal advertiser. Advertising is likely to start soon in the medical profession for a simple reason: our overcommunicated society is in the process of becoming an overmedicated one too. A study for the Department of Health and Human Services predicts a surplus of about 70,000 doctors by 1990. How will these excess doctors find patients to practice on? By advertising, of course. But the professionals who are opposed to advertising say it downgrades their profession. And it does. To advertise effectively today, you have to get off your pedestal and put your ear to the ground. You have to get on the same wavelength as the prospect.